Okay, hi everyone and welcome. My name is Ken Yang and I'm very excited to be joined today by Dr. Paul Kershaw, who will be talking to us about a very important topic of housing affordability and intergenerational equity. Paul is an award-winning professor at UBC and the founder of Generation Squeeze, which is a Canadian think and change tank that's championing generational fairness, in their words, to preserve what Canadians hold sacred: a healthy childhood, home, and planet, so we all leave a proud legacy. Paul's work has contributed to historic investments in BC childcare, the first ever tax on empty homes in North America, a shift in BC to reduce income taxes by taxing unhealthy home prices more. And he also successfully led the Intergenerational Climate Coalition to defend the constitutionality of carbon pricing in Saskatchewan, Ontario, and at the Supreme Court. And I'll tell you, he's also one of the few voices in Canada today advocating for solutions that actually get at the heart of the housing affordability crisis, which unfortunately many politicians and housing pundits still shy away from talking about. And that's why we invited him here today. But before we move on, I'd like to share a short land acknowledgement. I'm a second-generation Canadian living in Toronto, which is located on the traditional territories of many nations, including the Mississaugas, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples. And wherever you are, invite you to acknowledge the land you're on and the generations who came before you. Because I believe that land acknowledgement is especially relevant for the conversation we'll have today. Through our advocacy for affordable housing, we're actually seeking a new relationship to the land we're occupying, and just as importantly, to those we've excluded from it. And I believe that this is an important step to heal from the past and build a more fair future for all. Many of you are joining us today as a basic income supporter, and of course, the topic of housing affordability is very much connected to our cause. This call is co-hosted by UBI Works, a nonprofit that promotes basic income in Canada. We launch activist campaigns and petitions, organize events like marches and rallies, support economic research, and produce lots of content for social media to spread these ideas. I'm very happy to see many familiar faces from the community here with us today. Thanks for being with us. Commonwealth Canada is a new initiative launched earlier this year to promote policies that better share the earth and the commons, building on the advocacy work of UBI Works. Ideas like land value tax to address the housing crisis, and social dividends from wealth created by nature or society as a whole. What you see here on the screen is from a paper we published recently estimating the economic rents or excess profits that could be collected from Canada's land and natural resources. At $241 billion a year, we estimate that could be enough to raise the 0% income tax bracket up to $250K, which would eliminate income taxes for 98% of people in Canada. Or we could pay every adult almost $8,000 a year in dividends. And by collecting these rents, it would drastically lower land values and, by our estimates, make homes 40% cheaper. You can visit the link here if you're interested to read more. We will have a Q&A later. You can scan this QR code from your phone or visit slido.com where you can submit a question and vote on which ones we should cover. We'll have an official end after 1 hour, but anyone is free to stick around. We'll leave the Zoom open to continue the conversation. Now, I'd like to welcome Dr. Paul Kershaw. Paul, over to you.
Thank you very much. I will share my screen now. Nice to see everybody. Can I get a thumbs up from you, Ken, that you can see my slide? Great. All right, well, welcome everybody, and lovely to see such a pan-Canadian audience and an audience of different age ranges, which really matters for the theme that I will talk about today, which is intergenerational fairness and how it requires a tax shift. And I picked that theme of a tax shift, this idea of more taxation of housing wealth, less taxation of income, because that is really the core concept underpinning the land value tax work that Commonwealth is now leading. And I wanted to offer an intergenerational lens as yet another reason to kind of motivate that sort of thinking. You'll see that Generation Squeeze has been leading public dialogue and policy recommendations on a tax shift now for many years. I think by comparison with, the truest form of a land value tax, you'll see that our proposal is a bit more incremental. But even that incremental approach has received a great deal of pushback from some opposition. And so I think there's an interesting way in which what Jen Squeeze is doing with our tax shift is sort of trying to seed some ground that Commonwealth is also trying to grow fruitfully as well. I come today from the unceded territory of the Katzie people, and I really emphasize the unceded side of that equation. The Katzie people are located and have been for generations and generations and generations at the confluence of two rivers called the Fraser and Pitt Rivers, very large rivers in British Columbia. Colonized maps would show us as being Pitt Meadows, and Pitt Meadows is largely a suburb of Vancouver. It's part of Metro Vancouver. I identify as throughout my talk, you'll hear me talk about how I've gained housing wealth from the home that I own in this unceded land. And the prospect of getting more and more affluent and more prosperous in land that was ultimately unceded shows that my own personal story is deeply implicated in the harmful legacy of colonization, and means that somebody like me needs to be open very significantly to important conversations about land back. And so I encourage us to think seriously about those kinds of issues as we promote truth and reconciliation. When I think about generational fairness, it can get complicated quickly, but at bottom, I view three core concepts as sort of driving the lens that I'll feature for us today. And the first is, it means are we being good stewards? Are we preserving what's sacred today for those who follow in our footsteps? And that preservation work is going to require us to plan carefully for all ages, investing in well-being from the early years onwards. And if you do those two things, you get to ask yourselves, are we abiding by the intergenerational golden rule? Are we treating other generations as we would want those generations to treat ours? And I think that really starts to then ask the key questions like, what kind of unpaid bills, what kind of debts environmentally or fiscally might we be leaving for those who follow in our footsteps? And so those three concepts will be driving much of my thinking today. And I will argue that we're not doing any of these principles very well in our policy venues, whether we're talking about climate change, housing, government budgets more generally. On the climate change front, it's hard not to acknowledge that this has been a summer where extreme weather has just touched everybody, and it's smoky where I am right now, and I'm far from many of the fires in British Columbia. But at bottom, this harmful story of extreme weather is really a story of failure of stewardship, where in current years and in previous decades, we've been extracting so much of the atmosphere's scarce capacity to absorb carbon that we've been leaving extreme weather as our legacy for everyone now. The harm that does for those who are younger and those who are just about to be born just means their whole lives are going to be faced with this extreme weather. Then just quickly, I'll draw your attention to what is a summary for me of the 2023 federal budget. And I intentionally use large figures of elephants to get at this idea there's an elephant in the room. You'll see that the vast majority of new revenue produced by economic growth, much of that driven by real estate rental and leasing, is being, I might say, extracted by people that I love, that my mom's demographic, my aunts and uncles who are older, being used disproportionately for the benefits they need for old age security and medical care in their later years. But the way in which those dollars are being used for that purpose just dwarfs everything else that matters more often to a younger demographic, whether that's employment insurance. You can see childcare, which is rightly identified. $10 a day childcare is an historic investment. It's a new policy investment that we haven't seen in a generation, but it is so modest by comparison with the growth that we're seeing in investments later in our life course, given this demographic shift that's underway. Interestingly, the 2023 budget projects $132 billion in deficits. Spending on old age security and medical care for my mom's demographic, a demographic I'm deeply concerned about, does represent 85% of that deficit. You'll see similar patterns in provincial budgets. You're in Ontario. Here you can see how, spending on things like post-secondary, children's and social services, childcare, and education. And in fact, housing in Ontario was so small this year, I couldn't even find at the moment, something smaller than a mouse to show to you, are dwarfed by medical care. And medical care is also a very age-oriented public policy. Now, some listeners may be surprised to know that when we reach 65, reach a moment in our lives, we're going to use more medical care in our remaining years than we did in our first 65. It's critical that we have the system to support that, but it raises really significant questions about how do we raise revenue to ensure that that exists and invest earlier in the life course so that we prevent people from falling sick when it is preventable. And then for today's topic, which really will be disproportionately on housing, given Commonwealth's interest in that land value tax. Just as our revenue, just as our atmosphere's ability to absorb carbon, these are scarce resources. So too is wealth that can be produced from a housing system. And in recent years, in the past 10, 15, 20 years in particular, we've been extracting so much wealth from our housing system, myself included, that people like me have been kind of leaving the middle class and we've been joining the much more prosperous. But in the process of doing so, we leave so little affordability for those who follow in our footsteps. I am, a well-paid university professor who has been at my University of British Columbia for now almost 19 years. No, it is 19 years now. In that time, I've accumulated about $500,000 as my employer and I have been contributing to my pension. In one single year, my home has generated more value for me than that while I slept, watched television, and cooked. We can't want our housing system to be generating that kind of wealth that outpaces what labor does, and yet it is providing those windfalls so regularly for people like me, and especially people who are older than me, living in cities in BC and Ontario. And then we've spread the contagion of unaffordability from coast to coast to coast. I draw your attention here to lines that are blue and orange. This is a relatively complicated slide. I don't have the ability to go into all the details right now, given the time limits, but the blue line showing average home prices since sort of the baby boomers came of age as young adults to the contemporary period. And you'll see that that blue line in Canada has been leaving the orange line, which is typical earnings for a young person, all of this adjusted for inflation. So whereas it took the typical young person 5 years of full-time work in 1976 to save a 20% down payment on an average priced home, if you flash forward to the current era, it is now 17 years. In British Columbia, it's 22. So it goes in Ontario. In Metro Vancouver, 27. So it goes in the GTA. But I draw our attention back to sort of every province in the country and these growing home prices. Yes, some regions more than others, but there has been this trend more generally to be extracting for some homeowners more wealth for the system, which by definition is leaving less affordability for their kids and grandchildren and newcomers of any age. Canada isn't great at measuring wealth in our data systems, but we can do it periodically. And this is a very detailed table that I'm just drawing your attention to, that sort of pinkish category there, which is trying to say the punchline is that the net value, the gross value of a home less the mortgage, in principal residences in this country is $3.2 trillion higher than it was in 1977 after adjusting for inflation. And of that $3.2 trillion in additional inflation-adjusted wealth in homes, 2/3 of that is enjoyed now by those who are over 55. So it's unsurprising that those who got into the housing market earlier are those disproportionately benefiting from the substantial increases in housing values. And what I love about the intergenerational lens, though, is while that can be viewed as a benefit for an older demographic, though some people might challenge me on that today, and I'm looking forward to that conversation, that demographic also is in love with their kids and grandchildren who are harmed by that practice. And so this intergenerational theme allows us to attach into this love dynamic between generations in a family, and in a way that some might judge to be hokey. I'm wanting to bring that generational love more to the world of politics, because that will be a critical component for us in solving housing unaffordability going forward. To do so, we're going to need to recognize, and Ken was very kind in his introductory remarks to me, there's a part of the housing discourse that continues to be too quiet about one of the root causes of rising unaffordability in this country, and that is that we are culturally and politically addicted to high and rising home prices. Many, many regular Canadians are entangled in the expectation that home values are likely to rise, and they organize their behavior and their plans financially accordingly. And that then sustains a system that results in home prices continuing to rise. And so one of the key observations we make at the Gen Squeeze Lab is that we need to break that cultural addiction. And the first step in tackling any addiction is acknowledging the problem. This is a slide, it's a little bit out of date. I didn't have time on the plane home last evening to update it. But one thing to remind ourselves is that over the past 18 months, we have seen changes in monetary policy. I wish they'd happened, spread out way over the last 15 years, but a very concentrated moment of increased interest rates triggered by rising food and energy inflation. But as those interest rates rose, we did see, unsurprisingly, a shallowing of home prices, like the steady, relentless increase paused for a moment. But unfortunately, we don't see a real celebration of that stalling of home prices, of that moderation and the relentless growth. And I want to draw our attention to the fact that we're not celebrating that enough reflects our cultural addiction. Look here in terms of the way in which the narrative unfolds. I could pick headlines that are even more recent than this, but housing market is showing signs of weakness as home prices fall and bidding wars dissipate. Well, you only can think our housing system is weak if you think when home prices are falling and demand isn't bidding up prices for already built structures. You can only think that's weak if you think that the first and foremost purpose of a housing system is to generate wealth returns, as opposed to thinking that housing is first and foremost for homes. And so fundamental to the Gen Squeeze work and our argument for a tax shift, more taxation of housing wealth, less taxation of income, especially for middle and lower earners, that is driven by the principle of housing is for homes first, investments second. Now, notice I didn't say no investments. It is absolutely critical that, we can imagine people thinking that home ownership may still be in reach. People will take on a mortgage, a very large mortgage today by historical standards. And if over 25, 30, and 40 years, they're paying off that mortgage and now they have that equity, well, that's a kind of interesting forced savings piggy bank. That kind of equity accumulation may be very reasonable. But if that accumulation by paying off one's mortgage goes hand in hand with the expectation that home prices, one's own home is going to go up by 50%, 100%, 150%, 200% on top of that, well, now we're just trying to extract wealth windfalls from a housing system that is not your typical commodity. Look here, it's not just general sort of market conversations that happen in the media. It is built into our provincial governments. This is from BC. I should have taken the exact same material from the 2022 and 2023 Ontario budget. But notice where the language is always identical. Average sale price growth was strong across the province at over 10%, double digits. It's only strong then if we're thinking again of home prices driving wealth accumulation, not delivering affordable homes. And that language about a housing system being strong as home prices rise is not in keeping actually with what public polling data shows where Canadians' heads and hearts are at this moment. Canadians are actually quite clear that if we're concerned about affordability, if we want to restore affordability for all, then we need home prices to stall so that earnings can catch up. And polling data shows that, a large majority of Canadians agree with that perspective. And given that, we need to create more political cover for our politicians to courageously respond to the evidence and say, yes, let us think now that that's our goal for home prices. And let us be clear about that we don't want them to continue to rise. But that is a hard thing still to do in this country. What I'm showing to you here now is an infographic providing a summary of a comprehensive approach, the range of policy levers we need to pull to restore housing affordability forever. So much of the conversation, rightly so, tends to focus on the need to scale up non-market housing, and it's absolutely correct. But this is incredibly challenging to do. It's hard to scale up non-market housing if we keep losing control of land and home prices in the regular market. And too irregularly, including in the most recent report from leaders in the nonprofit sector. We're not drawing attention to how the need to scale up non-market housing has to go with a goal in the regular housing market that says we don't want those values to rise. Now, even if we were to double, triple, or even quadruple non-market housing in Canada and the supply of it, that would still leave the majority of Canadians relying on the regular market to make a home today. And so we have to very intentionally focus on fixing problems in the regular market. And you'll see in my list here that tends to mean about dialing down harmful kinds of demand, dialing up the right supply, dialing up for protection for renters in the regular market. But one of the things that we see too often in this effort to fix the regular market is, we tend to look for easy villains. And I was in Prince Edward Island this week where every time people were talking about housing and I heard ministers being questioned about, problems in housing, and the flavor of the month was these international students who come to our communities, they're actually paying massive levels of tuition to keep our universities financially solvent. And unsurprisingly, they need homes. And so they're going to be competing for rental as well. And maybe that adds some additional pressure. But that easy villain is it's maybe a minor part. Maybe it's one part of the overall complexity going on. But just as we have tended to focus on foreign buyers at a certain moment, or empty homes, or mean-spirited developers, or nasty NIMBYs, or municipal politicians who aren't efficient enough in improving new zoning, it's always somebody else that's the problem in housing, not actually getting us to the harder, deeper problems. Yes, they are all players in the unaffordability saga, but at the root cause of our housing system continuing to allow home prices to leave behind earnings is, as I said earlier, many regular, everyday Canadians, myself included, are entangled, culturally entangled, financially entangled by policy incentives to bank on home prices rising. And that is a much harder, deeper conversation. That requires us all to look in the mirror and ask ourselves, how might we not just be on the sidelines, but how might we be implicated unintentionally or otherwise in a broken housing system? And so as a result, I tend to think that what Jen Squeeze needs to do, and I think in partnership more and more with a group like Commonwealth, which is, I think, getting at this issue more than many other organizations as well. So we have to talk about breaking our addiction to high and rising home values. There's not just one silver bullet to do that. As in everything, there's complexity. I'm going to feature two themes, and I'm going to end on the tax shift idea. Theme number one, I want to reduce reliance on real estate to drive economic growth. This really matters. This is a description of Canada's GDP by industry and Canada's employment by industry. The dark blue lines are share of GDP, the lighter the share of employment. And you'll notice on the far left-hand side, I'm featuring real estate rental and leasing. And it is the biggest part of Canada's economy. It is the biggest part of Ontario's economy. In my province, it's 20% of gross domestic product. Yet fewer than 2% of Canadians, fewer than 2% of Ontarians, fewer than 2% of British Columbians make their livings in real estate rental and leasing. Now that is a disturbing pattern. To be sure, if you look just to the right of those first two columns, you'll see that construction is its own industrial category. So we know construction relates to real estate, absolutely. But construction's share of GDP and its share of employment are quite balanced. The only other part of our gross domestic product that shows such a key contribution to GDP and so little employment is also a very extractive industry, mining, oil, and gas. And yet even its extraction is not on par with the extraction of wealth from our housing system by comparison with those making their livings there. And so what does this all mean? Well, that prior to the recent moment of inflation and a dramatic number of interest rate hikes, we'd had low interest rates that were enabling people to borrow. And when people borrow in Canada, we're not investing even necessarily in new housing. We're not investing in new industry that's going to drive productivity. We're borrowing to invest to bid up the price of typically buildings that already existed, like my home. And yes, that does drive real estate. And I mean, that does drive gross domestic product. But if we're growing our economy where very few people make their living, then what you're doing is for those real estate agents, et cetera, they're making very good livings. People like me who are already homeowners, especially in some of our bigger cities in Ontario and BC, but more and more from coast to coast, you are having those people's wealth go up. But then anyone who's not in those two categories is falling further behind because they are not in industries where they're driving productivity, driving increased earnings that keep pace with housing. And so they fall behind relative to their major cost of living. They're having to work more to cover that major cost. It's one way to grow an economy, but I don't think it's a great way. If we really think that we want a healthy, strong economy, that should require less, not more work to pay for our major costs of living. And it ought to be sustainable socially, economically, environmentally. And that is not what our current system is doing. Now let me end with a second bullet point about what it takes to break our cultural addiction to high and rising home values. And this has everything to do with the kind of focus on land value taxation that Commonwealth is particularly interested in, and that our tax shift agenda squeeze is pushing towards, albeit in a more incremental way than Commonwealth's starting point with an overall land value tax. For those who may not be tax policy experts, I like the left-hand part of my slide just to remind us, look, what's at issue? What are the policy incentives that our tax policy are creating? And any of us who are going to work today, or any of us who have worked in the past, when we went and did our labor, all of the income we earn from our labor is subject to taxation. Now, if we then take some of our after-tax earnings from labor and we say, I'm going to invest in the stock market or in a mutual fund, then half of any return on that investment is going to be subject to capital gains taxation. But when it comes to wealth windfalls that I've enjoyed in my principal residence, and many others like me have, barely any of that is ever taxed at all. And so we create this home ownership tax shelter that then inclines Canadians to think, oh, a good way to make an after-tax investment return is to do it through housing. And it just fuels that cultural addiction to high and rising home values. And I've already showcased for you that after adjusting for inflation, over a generation, we have seen that the value of homes have gone up by over $3 trillion. And that's in principal residence, all of which is largely sheltered from taxation. At a moment when we do have an aging population that has needs, when you have a younger population that is facing so much economic vulnerability, when we're running deficits, even when we are not in a recession. And so it gives us reason to think about how we might adjust our tax policy and how we might actually find some relief on middle and lower earners through tax reductions on their income that could be compensated for by growing tax revenue through focusing more on taxing housing wealth. And I don't just mean, groups like the NDP are good at talking about wealth, but Jagmeet Singh tends to be like the uber rich, like only the 1%, and the big corporate groups. But I do think that the we are the 99% has caused some problems in Canada that suggest that there is no heterogeneity in the 99%. And yet there's tremendous heterogeneity in the overall, prosperity that is amongst the 99%. And so with colleagues at Generation Squeeze, the University of Calgary, the University of Victoria, the Cooperative Housing Federations in BC and elsewhere, nonprofit housing associations, the University of Montreal, other NGOs, tax groups, policy groups, we put together a proposal that would add some progressivity to property taxation at the provincial and/or federal level. And the idea is that we would focus on the value of homes above $1 million. And we would add a modest surtax that would kick in and very modestly between 1 and 1.5 million, slightly less modestly between 1.5 and 2 million, and then a little more, but still relatively modestly after $2 million. Very importantly, you should know that we are not proposing a capital gains tax. And if anyone's interested in this, I can talk about why I don't think capital gains taxation of principal residences actually gets at the root issues of intergenerational tensions in our housing system. You will see, I explicitly say on this slide that we are thinking about the politics of a tax shift. And we're trying to reduce overall resistance by, yes, preserving a lot of the tax shelter on housing wealth in principal residences by freeing about 90% of homes, 90% of households from the incremental change that we would be proposing. That is done for political reasons as much as policy substance. What would it look like? Well, if you're someone who does not live in a home that is worth $1 million in this country right now, as established by your annual municipal property taxation evaluators, then you wouldn't face any change whatsoever in terms of additional wealth taxation on your home, and you might benefit from reductions in your income tax. If you have a $1.1 million home, it's a very modest increase, $200 a year. If you're getting closer to $2 million, then you're getting more around 2,500. And if you cross that 3 million threshold, then you're starting to get to, it would be an additional $13,500. Now, when you're at $3 million homes in this country, you're, there's only 1% of homes in the country that are at that range. So we're asking the top 1% of homeowners to actually contribute in taxation what we typically ask of somebody making median earnings in the country from income taxes. And remember that if you own a home over $1 million, you might think everybody does that today, but that's not true. Only about 10 to 12% of households in this country reside in homes over $1 million. I'm among that. Now, I'll show you that groups like the Canadian Taxpayers Federation have, suggested this is new and outrageous and scary, but that's not at all true. We're all used to, if you're a homeowner, already paying property tax annually. Indeed, we would be allowing those who are in homes over $1 million, if they don't want to pay the annual tax right now, they could defer it until the sale of the home when more liquidity in that asset becomes available, and they would just do so at a modest interest rate. And anyone who is actually got a home that's for rental purposes, they would be exempted entirely, because we do want to be incentivizing rental housing, especially though purpose-built rental housing. Our estimates show that we would be generating about $5 billion a year with this incremental approach, which could definitely build 150,000 permanently affordable rentals in co-ops a year. Or it could be contributing more to income tax cuts, or boosting the portable renters benefit that was created as part of the National Housing Strategy more recently. And more generally, what we're saying is it's time. It is time to ask the 10% of Canadians owning the most valuable housing to tolerate a moderate price on housing inequity in order to demonstrate allegiance to the Canadian dream that a good home should be in reach for what hard work can earn, whether that's a home in rental, whether that's a home in co-op, whether that is an owner or some other tenure. As mentioned, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation uses this tax shift idea and distorts it. They don't talk about the tax shift. They don't even portray the recommendation to add taxation on very high value homes. They present it as we are coming after the home equity, and any homeowner out there in Canada, Dr. Paul Kershaw, is the big bad tax man coming to steal your housing wealth. And they are good at it. They build their list, they fundraise. As I was flying home from PEI, where I had the good fortune to be able to brief the Prime Minister and his cabinet during their recent retreat, the fact that I was there was made public. And then the Canadian Taxpayers Federation launched just another new campaign, now claiming I've got $450,000 to study how we are going to steal homeowners' money. And started a campaign to challenge that idea, and the idea that we're proposing a capital gains tax on all Canadian homeowners. It's fictitious, but they're good at doing it. It results in a range of spam, angry people. So the Canadian Taxpayers Federation is framing the debate these days in ways that pump up resistance to the kind of tax shift that we're getting, because people just have this instinctive reaction and it's misinformed. F off and die is actually one of the nicer emails. Sometimes people talk about how they would like me to die. But actually, those emails are not in keeping with where public support is. And I will just end now with some polling information. The percent of Canadians who support a modest surtax on owners of the most valuable homes, when we talk about adding a modest surtax on the top 10% of homes, 68% of Canadians support that idea. The top 25% of homes, which actually would be homes way less valuable than $1 million, you still have close to 2/3. Clearly, though, when people are hearing this question, they're thinking that most homeowners live in more valuable homes than they actually do. Most houses, I should say. And when we make it explicit, we mean homes over $1 million. So there's no mistake what we're talking about adding, that additional taxation to. You still have, over a majority of people supporting it. And then think about when we actually ask homeowners who self-identify as being in homes that are over $1 million. And you can see that when we talk about taxing the top 10% of homes, you have about 2/3 of that group saying, yeah, I'm open to that. Now, that's partly because there's a little bit of confusion about, are they in that top 10% group? So when we make it explicit and we say we are going to add a modest price on housing inequity, kind of modeled after the modest price on pollution, you get to see that still a majority of people who self-identify as being owners of homes over $1 million a majority support it. But if you frame it as a surtax, just that framing alone causes the support to plummet. So I think that's a really key insight to us. And my last slide. On top of that majority support amongst Canadians generally, and even homeowners who self-identify as being owners of those properties above $1 million, on top of that majority support, poll respondents indicate that their support would increase if the tax shift would pay for income tax cuts for middle and lower earners. 43% of people say that their support would increase, pay for more affordable housing, 40%, about the same amounts if it was to pay for more medical care, long-term care, and pharmacare for our aging population, slightly less for childcare. It absolutely is a policy change that will help break our addiction to high and rising home prices. So it would help slow those home prices, giving earnings a chance to catch up. That resonates with people. Reducing wealth inequality resonates with people. Reducing inequality between renters and owners resonates with people. And even there's a decent portion of people who understand that if you're in Atlantic Canada right now, or Saskatchewan, Alberta, Manitoba, even to some degree Quebec, and I saw that we were getting people from all of these regions, the fact that a homeowner in BC and Ontario, where we are accumulating so much wealth in our principal residences, which is not going taxed, but then we are having to pay income taxes just as everybody else is who isn't getting that high wealth windfall from their housing. There is an interregional inequity there. And so in many respects, Atlantic Canada, the prairies are contributing more in taxes than they ought to be, given that we are not taxing fairly the wealth windfalls that have been disproportionately generated in BC and Ontario. And there's clearly room to build that message, because when people hear it, they're like, oh yeah, that doesn't seem right either. So I'll end there, inviting people to say we do need a tax shift, from taxing incomes and lowering that for low and moderate income individuals, compensating with additional taxation on high value housing wealth. I would urge both the land and the building, if you want to get into why I think that way. We need to do that for a broad range of reasons, including helping to fix our broken intergenerational system. If this is at all motivating to you, I do ask you to go to gensqueeze.ca and join us at our website, because our power grows with the size of our network. And if you're wanting to keep involved in hearing some of the Gen Squeeze ideas, if you're a reader, you can find it on gensqueeze.ca, the website. But if you're interested in hearing or listening, you can check out our Hard Truth videos and our Hard Truth podcast. Thank you very much.
Wow. Thank you so much, Paul. That was incredible. Thanks for sharing that wonderful presentation with us. And I encourage you all to look up Generation Squeeze. They have a beautiful website with really, really awesome articles proposing some very bold ideas that I think are perhaps some of the most important ideas of our generation and for future generations. And arguably, if we are to address the problem of affordability, I think we simply can't continue gaslighting the entanglement that Paul's been talking about. And so that's why I feel a remarkable alignment between Gen Squeeze Lab and our work at Commonwealth. And Paul, I'm very excited to continue pushing these ideas forward with you. Now, I'd like to introduce Floyd Marinescu. He's the founder of UBI Works in Commonwealth, and he will join in on a fireside chat with Paul, and then we'll go to questions. Floyd?
Hi, everyone. Thank you. And I apologize for some background noise. I just coming off of a doctor's appointment. Paul, really great talk. Very inspiring. And I look at Gen Squeeze as maybe a grown-up version of what Commonwealth could be one day, or maybe we'll work together more closely in the future. Yeah, and I listened to your talk with a bit of a heavy heart. Most of us on this call, I think, had a dual interest in basic income. And now we kind of brought some people along on this new Commonwealth journey and continuing to do both separately. And, as basic income advocates, we want everyone to have a minimum floor to afford rents and to afford livelihood. But research shows that rising home prices literally creates poverty. Some research out of California likened it to a game of musical chairs, where, homes that previously would have been afforded by middle-class people are now being bought by upper middle-class people because it's too expensive, and middle-class people are buying homes that used to be owned by low-income people, and then low-income people are being forced on the streets.
Exactly.
So, like, on the one hand, we want people to have an income support. On the other hand, the whole system is designed to outprice cost of living and put people on the streets. It's like a self-defeating proposal, not basic income, but just the way the whole system is. So in good conscience, one of the reasons why we moved on to also advocate for changing our relationship to land and housing so we can actually reduce cost of living at the same time as we create a basic income so that everyone can prosper and share in economic growth.
Well, we're very aligned on that front as well. That is a big part of the Gen Squeeze theory of change.
Yeah. So I very much support your the property tax surtax increases. Interestingly, I mean, research has been shown that property tax is actually the best tax in terms of not distorting economic growth and harming the market. And people who like to say that it's communism or some sort of socialism should look at Texas and Florida, who don't have state income taxes but have very high property taxes.
Exactly.
Or in case of Texas, actually has Commonwealth, has a lot of publicly owned land that's used to pay for the high school system, usually basically having Commonwealth that offsets not the need to have income tax. So I always find that kind of interesting. Yeah, last night I was talking to a friend who just bought a condo off the plan. It's not finished yet, and it's already going to be in the negative, and the rent that he'll be able to generate won't pay for his mortgage. And his ideology, his concept is, well, I wait for interest rates to go down and then the value will come back. And I'm like, oh my God, that is so depressing. Like, that is literally the game. That is the investment game, causing people to make irrational decisions and harming everyone else as a result. Which is why at Commonwealth we're proposing a land value tax to effectively decommodify land so that the only incentives are to construct, to renovate, to build, to profit off the creating and providing homes, not off simply sitting in the homes and waiting for prices to go up. So really glad that we're aligned on that front. So this call officially ends in 15 minutes, but typically we have questions submitted, and we often go as long as really there's questions coming. Are you willing to stay? So
I'm here till I do unfortunately have to run promptly at the hour, but I'm here for the next 15 to take questions. And I realize now actually I went a few minutes longer than you intended, and I apologize to the listeners for slowing down the opportunity to get to questions. That was not my intention.
Okay. Great. I'll just throw a couple questions and we'll go into user submitted questions. You mentioned, it really was eye-popping to me, that it's hard to scale up. Like, even if we have 4 times more non-market housing, that it probably won't make a difference when the market incentives are still driving up pricing. So what is, like, ultimately how do we change the game? Like, surely the property tax surtaxes will help, but what more needs to be done to make all these solutions work well together?
Yeah, well, great. So just to be clear, why do I say even if we quadruple? So, Stats Can often, says we only have about 3% of the housing, 3% of Canadians are in social housing. I think that's actually quite an underestimation if you think the range of way we subsidize housing, but it's probably more like 7, 8, 9, 10% at most. So double it, it's 20. Triple it, which we're not going to do anytime soon, 30. Quadruple it, which would be amazing. But yet at 40, you still have the majority of people needing to rely on the regular housing market. So that's just where I'm saying on the quadrupling, that's what it would take. We absolutely do need to be building a more supply of housing. And so I think right now that narrative has captured people's attention, and it captured a lot of the policy attention, whether you're in Ontario with the Ford government, and the debates around the number of homes you need and the nastiness around the Greenbelt issues. It's certainly, so that's a conservative government. It's certainly a dominant narrative now with an NDP government in BC. It is the dominant narrative with the Liberal government federally. Notice I just showed my nonpartisan bona fides there. And it's important. We need more supply. 2 points to make on that, though. If supply were the primary factor, then Alberta home prices should be higher than BC and Ontario's home prices. Alberta has the same population size as BC. It actually has higher incomes than BC, and they have yet lower supply per capita than do BC and Ontario. And yet Alberta has half the average home values of BC and Ontario. So supply clearly matters, but it's not the only thing driving the high and rising home prices. And what's driving it in Ontario is Ontario sort of caught it with BC with kind of having the psychology of our housing market. Like, this is a thing that just keeps going up and up, and we get used to it. And people like me, we like it. And then we're like, let's not stop this gravy train, even when it's harming our kids and grandchildren. And so I honest to goodness think, I am a public policy scholar at the University of British Columbia. I don't think solving housing unaffordability or housing wealth inequality is any longer a policy problem. There are policy solutions. They're not even that complicated. The problem is cultural. And so that's why I think that groups like Gen Squeeze need to have concrete policy solutions, but we need to be playing in the shifting hearts and minds through, in some regards, the kind of social marketing campaigns that, that groups like Commonwealth do. I wish sometimes Gen Squeeze was better at what we do on that front. I think that's the root issue. And so one of the things I love about this call is I can tell from the faces that you have an intergenerational audience. And so my plea would be disproportionately towards the older members of your audience to say, I need your help. We need your help to provide some political cover for politicians to courageously act on the sheer observation that if we don't have home prices stall, you can't scale up non-market housing, because the land that the nonprofit housing is going to need to find is going to have to come often from the market. And if that value is so high, it makes fewer resources available to buy it and build on it. And as we lose the cost of buildings themselves, and that just drives up the cost of new builds, then it's more expensive to scale up. So we got to just have a dampening impact on overall home values. It has to be our goal. And if an older demographic could say, we're fine with that, that's okay, wow, would that start to change the dynamic? Because right now, politicians, despite the polling we can show, don't think it's politically safe. Wow. And so I'm looking for a cadre of grandmothers in particular, because I don't know, grandmothers always see extra nurturing. Sometimes grandfathers can be grumpy, but I'm sure there are no grumpy grandfathers on this call. But those non-grumpy grandfathers and all lovely grandmothers, we need your voices to help your kids and grandchildren desperately on this issue. That's the cultural shift I think we need. One last thought. So it's public knowledge at the cabinet retreat where I was just presenting, I was on a panel on youth issues. If you go to Gen Squeeze's website, you'll see we never talk about it as youth issues. We talk about intergenerational tension. And that's because the challenges that a younger demographic are facing aren't really about what they're doing. It's actually about what an older demographic has been doing to them as a result of their previous policy decisions around zoning, around taxation, around government spending, and so on. And that's what we need an older demographics help with. Please. Sorry, move on to the next question. That was too much of a soapbox.
No, that's amazing. I mean, Alberta's shown to be a little unstable for long-term housing returns due to the changing oil market. So that makes perfect sense that Vancouver and Ontario would be the stable long-term growth prospects investment zone. So there's some questions here related to your proposal. Are you suggesting a surtax also on second and third properties? And what exactly is the income tax shift? I know your 2018 paper, you suggested a provincial 0% zero tax up to $30,000 of income. Has your views evolved from there? Like, what is your proposal now?
Yeah, great question. What was the first half of the question, though? I just sort of blanked. You had two parts there.
Oh, shit, I can't remember. What did I say?
Can anyone else just chime in?
Your second and third properties.
Are you proposing
a surtax on investment properties too?
No. So we already do have capital gains taxation on those second and third properties. So I think we have a tax strategy to capture some of that. One could talk about whether or not 50% of the capital gain being taxed is the right level, or whether or not we want to be pushing that up, et cetera. And that goes into the broader conversation about flipping of homes. But it's the principal residence, which is this disproportionate home ownership tax shelter. And that's where the annual surtax on property, not done at a municipal level for a whole range of reasons, because that will create inefficiencies at a friggin' street level. We need it at a provincial level minimally, and it would make sense federally. And I'm agnostic at this stage about how to deliver the income tax savings, or it could be a sales tax savings for that matter. I would be supportive, I think, of whatever we judge from polling is the most politically saleable to help launch the tax shift. The key, though, I think, is to disproportionately deliver it in a way that helps lower and middle and lower earners, and perhaps in particular renters.
Yeah, that's why. So Commonwealth proposal is that a land value tax could raise the 0% income tax bracket all the way up to $88,000, which would help basically the bottom 80% who've been most locked out of housing profit gains and wage growth. So it's a complete reversal of fortunes for those who need it most.
You couldn't go that high with our surtax. Like, our rate isn't high enough to do that. But the logic driving yours, so you could have the same logic. You'd just be raising that 0% rate to a more modest level than your proposal.
Okay, so we have some questions here on are the most effective or fastest to implement next steps for you likely to be federal or provincial? Kind of like how Tommy Douglas took provincial healthcare first.
Yeah, well, I would say anyone who's in the BC context will know that around 2018, when we were proposing our tax shift, BC did a modest approach to this. We added a surtax on home value above $3 million, and the rate on it is very, very low. So I think that there's room in British Columbia to think about dropping the threshold at which the surtax applies and seeing that the surtax rate goes up moderately. So I think that that is a provincial campaign that could be won. I'm not convinced Ontario is right ground right now. And at the federal level, well, I have to say the federal level has been making these incremental stated. They got a flipping tax that is, moving them in that direction. And so I think if we were to take on like the Canadian Tax Federation and debunk some of their BS myths, we could tap into the broader polling at a federal level. I'm not sure if the next 18 months are the most prime moment for that, because we are starting to head into an election. And so this is a complicated issue and could be easily framed as like politically not advisable. But if we see post to the next federal election, then I think that's the moment to really start priming this conversation for whatever government is there. Because I'll even say Mr. Poilievre has talked about a housing aristocracy. And he's right, that's a really great language. If we could find the right way to start, doing some serious income tax cuts and shift to a large number of people who actually aren't his constituency, and he gets a lot more of the rural vote, he's getting people outside of the cities who aren't necessarily in the high value homes, I think you could actually find a win-win there too.
Yeah, in fact, if you look at graphs of housing prices versus incomes, everything started to shift after I believe the Harper Conservative government changed banking credit regulations to give banks infinite right to print as much credit as they want with no constraints, no more fractional reserve lending. And the US didn't do that, and US still has income to home price ratios within a normal range. And
I'll just add on that. This is one of the pieces of breaking the cultural diction that I didn't emphasize. But for anyone who wants to get wonkish, go to Gen Squeeze and look at some of our talk about looks at the dark side of the cheap credit system, how Statistics Canada has been letting down Canadians, especially younger generations, in their measurement of inflation. Why does that matter? Because the Bank of Canada's mandate is to keep inflation at around 2%. Who measures inflation? The CPI, done by StatsCan. But they don't measure housing inflation well in the CPI. When it comes to the experience of younger people, housing is crowding them out because of how much of a down payment they need to save. StatsCan doesn't monitor that. How much more money in total they need to borrow from banks to have a mortgage. StatsCan doesn't measure that. What StatCan measured is how much interest do you need to pay on whatever you have borrowed once you've got a down payment. Sure, that's relevant, but that's especially relevant to me once I'm in the housing market. And by ignoring the experience of trying to get into the housing market, StatsCan has been wildly underestimating housing inflation. And if only they'd signaled to us in 2005, around 2010, 2015, like all throughout that period, we'd been having housing inflation that would have, if measured properly, taken us above 2%. And we could have had, one interest rate hike in around mid-2000s, one later 2000s, one mid-2010s, one later 2010s. And that could have helped, put a downward pressure. We didn't do that in the past, and now people are experiencing interest rate hikes as so much harm. But monetary policy matters for actually containing the rise of home prices going forward. And StatsCan is letting us down. I guess last one before I'm going to have to leave.
Okay. Wow. Okay, so let's pull something from the questions that's a little broader. Well, there's a lot of questions here about land versus property tax, but maybe it's a little too wonkish to end with. Maybe why don't we end with, I guess, what have you learned from your advocacy work, and what victories have you claimed? I noticed Olivia Chow just won the mayoral race in Toronto, proposing a tax that's very similar to yours, a surtax on the highest end homes. Yeah, let us know. How's that been going?
I will confess we didn't directly lobby the design of that campaign platform. So I would say we would have contributed to that more diffusely by having been out on this issue for the last 5 years, including in Ontario. And we did write a strong report on this theme heading into the provincial election in Ontario. So we're in that zeitgeist. We did do some of the low-hanging fruit on improving housing wealth taxation. So we worked with the city of Vancouver to launch the first ever tax on empty homes. People might be surprised that in the first and second drafts of the National Housing Strategy, when the governments identified who was vulnerable in the housing system, they only identified one age group. It was seniors. And Gen Squeeze went and worked so hard, and it took to the third draft where we finally won the day. We're like, wait a second, an age analysis would actually show seniors generally are not the ones who are vulnerable in the housing market. Seniors have the highest rates of home ownership typically of any age group. Seniors have had the most time to accumulate wealth from rising home prices. Yes, those seniors who are not homeowners are vulnerable just like anybody else. Seniors who need long-term care housing are vulnerable, but make it narrower and to have excluded young people entirely. That's just missing the whole problem. And indeed, if you look at the draft that came out, the third draft did identify young adults in that group that were vulnerable, making them eligible for billions of support they would have otherwise been excluded from. But never once does the National Housing Strategy mention the word wealth. And if the National Housing Strategy can't mention the word wealth, then it is missing what is driving why we as a society have tolerated high and rising home prices. And so I'm desperately hoping that an upgrade to the National Housing Strategy starts grappling with the tremendous amount of wealth we've been producing. This isn't a moment of scarcity in our housing system. We have been printing money in our housing system, and yet we tolerate rising levels of homelessness. Within my region, we literally took dump trucks and policemen to take people off the streets living in tents and moving them somewhere else because we can't find the way to build the housing to get them off the street. This is not a moment of scarcity when it comes to housing. There is wealth. We have been sheltering it from taxation. If we change that, we can solve housing unaffordability, relieve taxes in other ways. We can make our housing system and our country thereby more generally work for young and old alike and newcomers of any age. Why don't I end there?
Fantastic. Well, I think that is the perfect way to end this call. I'd like to thank you so much for your time and imparting your vision and bold solutions to the rest of us. And I look forward to collaborating on this mission together.
Wonderful. And if I could ask you to make sure you share with me the URL for the video. I'm sure that there will be other members of our Gen Squeeze community who would welcome the chance to listen to the questions and answer period as well.
And I believe there are other experts on this call. We could probably answer some of the other community questions that are not specifically oriented towards Paul. So if anyone wants to stick around, maybe stay around another 15 minutes or so. Paul, thank you very much.
My regrets that I have to leave before other people are signing off. I would have enjoyed staying longer. Have a wonderful time.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.